Hey everyone, my name is Jill Greenberg and I'm an investor at CapitalG, which is Alphabet's independent growth fund. I spend almost all of my time looking at companies in the data infrastructure and data analytics stack, where we've made investments in companies like Databricks, Looker, Dataiku, Calibra, and more. We're big thesis-driven investors, so we spend a bunch of time thinking about how has the category evolved historically, what are the key pain points with that evolution, and how is it likely to evolve going forward? And I'm excited to share some of those insights with you all today. So I think we talk a lot about the data infrastructure stack from a technology perspective. So who are the key players? How has that evolved over time? Is it more or less fragmented, things of that nature? But I think where we generally spend less time is thinking through how does this land on the key decision makers, especially at big enterprise companies. And so part of what we've done is ask 50 chief data officers at Fortune 500 companies, how do they think about the evolution of the data stack? What are they excited about investing in over time? Where is the budget likely to come from? Is it new or existing? Which category are they going to allocate different parts of budget towards different parts of the data stack? Where do they think there's likely to be the most innovation over time? So we ran this survey, and I'm excited to share over the next 30 minutes or so some of the feedback that we got from these chief data officers and how it relates to our thesis on the space going forward. We've seen a ton of different versions of this photo, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it. But generally, the way we think about the modern data stack is sort of fitting into 4 categories. The first is data sources, where the data is being generated. The second is some type of data integration tooling, whether that looks like ETL, ELT, or EL and separate T. The third is data storage and management, whether that's in a warehouse, a lake, and data marts within your warehouse, et cetera. And then the final is some type of data analytics, whether that's sort of your separate BI and analytics layer or more data science and AI ML layer. So that's generally how we think about the modern data stack as it exists today. But what we like to think about is, well, how did we actually get to this picture? And as we zoom out, we think of sort of 4 major trends, and 3 are on this page. The first is obviously just generally a move to the cloud, which I'm not going to spend any time talking about since, I think we've all thought and talked about that quite a bit. But the 3 that are more interesting and particular to the data stack are more data, more users, and more use cases. And so in general, over the past 5 years, there's been this massive proliferation of the amount of data that's being generated by a variety of different sources that folks are wanting to use to make decisions that drive, key things about their organization. That's related to the second piece, which is more users. It's no longer a situation where you have one data and analytics team sitting within one very specific category of the organization that's running standardized reports that folks are looking at on a monthly basis. Instead, you have folks across the organization hoping to use this data to make decisions that drive their day-to-day jobs. And I think that's a huge change in the way the data stack has to be structured now that it is more, there are just generally more folks using this data. And the final piece is more use cases. Again, it's no longer like, hey, we just look at data in a standardized report every month and it's the same exact report. Instead, you have folks across the organization using it to make a quick ad hoc decision or piping it into customer-facing applications or whatever it might be. And so this explosion of data, users, and use cases has just led to a fundamentally different data infrastructure stack to support these changes. And so again, sort of this evolution of the stack went from something that looked in sort of the old world as something that was quite consolidated. And, maybe everything was sitting on the Oracle stack or the SAP stack or whatever it might be. And each of these trends sort of pushed it to something that looks a lot more fragmented and has really best-in-class solutions across the entire pipeline. So you've got best-in-class solutions on the data integration side. You've got best-in-class solutions on the storage side, whether it's a data warehouse, a data lake. You have different solutions for data analytics use cases versus data science use cases. And then you've got this sort of new layer that sits across a more fragmented pipeline in order to manage the data as it's moving from integrated specific piece of technology to the next specific piece of technology. And so this is sort of how the stack very broadly has evolved over time. And it's continuing to evolve. And you'll see a lot of super interesting companies in this space. And, I'll spend a lot more time on this later on in the talk, but I think there's interesting companies popping up in data reliability and data observability, more next-gen data analytics platforms that are sort of integrating those analytics and insights into the BI platforms. coordination and transformation layers that are separate from ELT or traditional ETL, interesting democratized AI ML platforms, things of that nature, new streaming solutions instead of batch solutions. So there's just constant innovation in this space. But I think the thing that's important to recognize is when you zoom out and say, okay, we've made this giant leap from something that feels super consolidated to something that feels a little bit more fragmented, where we have actual best-in-class solutions that are oriented towards the different set of users that are leveraging data and the different types of use cases. What are the problems that exist with this data stack as it exists today? The reason we're curious about those problems is because it helps inform how things are likely to change going forward. Because the next evolution of the data stack should be and likely will be oriented at the challenges, at solving the challenges that exist today when you ask these chief data officers. And so as part of our work, we asked, what are the 5 key issues with the data stack as it exists today? And this is what came back from surveys and conversations with experts and things of that nature. The first is just the cost of the cloud. And part of it is the absolute cost, but more of it is just predicting cloud costs and understanding what will my bill look like next month or next year, especially as data continues to grow in terms of just actual volume. The second is data quality and governance. And part of that comes from regulatory pressures, but part of that also just comes from being able to understand where and how data is moving across the stack, so that when you're making decisions with that data, you feel confident that the decisions are correct. The third is data silos, and this is one that we've talked about sort of at length. But the concept here is being able to find data and understand where the data sits is a huge pain point for many organizations, especially as the data volume proliferates. And so as you have data sitting in certain data marts within your data warehouse or within the data lake or wherever it might be, it's becoming quite challenging to be able to leverage data as it's distributed across a variety of different storage mechanisms. The fourth is single source of truth. And that has to do, it's almost a symptom of this data silos concept, but effectively here, folks are concerned with the fact that if you ask the finance team about what the revenue figure might be in April, that might be different than the figure that you get if you were to ask the marketing team. And that's just, it's not either of them are wrong. It's just that they're defining revenue as, in different terms. Maybe they're excluding a certain geography or over a different time horizon, but it does lead to confusion as you're trying to make decisions for the business. And so finding a way to have sort of a single source of truth where you can trust the data that you're leveraging is becoming quite important. And the fifth and final is the thing that came up most frequently and sort of encompasses sort of 2 through 4, which is time to insight. And the concept here is like the entire reason you even have a data infrastructure stack or data technologies where you're investing, a significant amount of money is so that you can get data from the source into an insight as quickly as possible and leverage that insight to make a decision about your business that will drive it forward. That is the entire point of the data stack. And I think as it's become more complicated, largely again because of these trends of more data, more users, and more use cases, and then more of a fragmented stack, chief data officers are observing that sometimes it takes longer to get to an insight than they would prefer. And so that's sort of a key issue that chief data officers are really looking to try to solve with new tools over the next 3 to 5 years. And so I won't spend any time on this slide. I think this sort of is exactly what I just described over the past few slides. But the concept here is a huge part of our work is to understand how has the data stack evolved over the past 5 years? What are the key pain points with today's data stack? And what does that lead us to be excited about in terms of investment over the next 5 to 10 years? Because presumably many of these new pieces of technology will be targeted towards solving pain points that folks have with their data stack today. And so as part of that, what we'd like to talk about next is when we went out and asked these chief data officers, where are you likely to invest over the next 5 to 10 years? Where do you see opportunities for massive innovation as you look at the technology that you've invested in to date? I'm excited to share with you some of their answers. So as I mentioned, the slides that follow are the result of a survey of 50 chief data officers at Fortune 500 companies that we ran over the past quarter. And we asked them we put this next slide. We put sort of this set of themes in front of them and asked a bunch of questions about this set of themes. And so what you see here is we broke it down into sort of broadly the 4 categories of the data stack: data prep, data storage, data usage, and data management. And we asked them to rank and prioritize among these different themes that we've seen in terms of bottoms up of a bunch of interesting companies getting started in each of these spaces. So within data prep, we looked at data orchestration and transformation, real-time streaming. Within data storage, we looked at distributed SQL querying or federated querying and data sharing. Within data usage, we looked at smart analytics or augmented analytics, AI ML ops, machine learning model explainability, feature management, and collaborative data science notebooks. And within data management, we looked at data observability or reliability and data access controls. So we put this list of themes in front of these chief data officers with sort of a description of what we meant by each of them. And then we asked them, force rank your top 7 in terms of what you think will emerge as a big category with significant innovation over the next 5 years. And that's this chart on the left-hand side of this page. We also asked them, for this same list of themes, force rank your top 7 in terms of where you're likely to invest budget dollars over the next 5 years. And so what we wanted to know is, like, where do you see interesting innovation, and where do you see that interesting innovation where you're likely to actually spend money on those tools? On the left-hand side, where they think there's interesting innovation to come, is real-time data streaming, smart analytics, so this next generation of BI tooling where you're sort of serving up insights rather than relying on somebody to go in and type a question and receive an insight. And then finally, data orchestration and transformation. Those are sort of the ones. Data access controls also sort of rose to the top here. Those are the ones that emerged as really very likely to be in the top 3 for many of these chief data officers. You see the same, maybe not surprisingly, categories rise to the top when you ask about where people are likely to invest budget dollars. Again, smart analytics, real-time data streaming, and data orchestration and transformation all rose to the top. Now, this is not surprising given when we asked about the key pain points, as we spoke about a few slides ago, a lot of folks were talking about really getting this time to insight to be a lot shorter. And so that sort of makes sense as you think about, okay, smart analytics, that's something that allows you to elevate insights much more quickly than relying on folks within your organization to ask the right questions. Real-time data streaming, obviously that's very tightly aligned with something like getting insights from their source or data from the source to insights as quickly as possible. And then data orchestration and transformation, obviously those are sort of aspects of tooling that allow you to more seamlessly get data into a spot where you feel like it's driving insights in a reliable fashion. And so it's not surprising maybe that these are the categories that emerged as quite interesting in areas of investment over the next 5 years for these chief data officers. The next question though is, all right, where is the budget coming from? You know, especially for large enterprises, you really want to think about, is this existing budget and you're just sort of repointing it from a different category? Or is it completely net new budget, which is fine, but it sort of requires a different type of go-to-market if you're thinking about it from sort of a company perspective. And so we then asked, for these categories, what do you see it? Is the budget coming from net new budget, which is the dark blue on these bars, existing budget, or no budget? We wouldn't spend any money on this at all. And what you can see here is things like data observability, smart analytics, orchestration, and transformation tooling. Those are more likely to have existing budget dollars allocated towards those solutions, which again is not surprising, because if you think about the evolution of the stack that we were talking about earlier, a lot of large enterprises already have budget allocated towards tools like Informatica, which sort of spanned the entirety of data integration and data prep and data observability and management. And I think large organizations are thinking about, okay, if we're no longer using Informatica, relying less on Informatica, and we're using some of these newer sort of cloud native best-in-class tools, how do we think about taking that Informatica budget and allocating it across these different types of tooling? So that's not surprising. Similarly with smart analytics, like you imagine a lot of this budget is just coming from existing budget for BI tooling, and they might take some of that budget and allocate it towards augmented analytics solutions like Sisu, as an example, that could be layered on top of BI tooling to make it more effective. Or you could even imagine them allocating that budget towards a next-gen version of BI, which is much more oriented towards augmented analytics and sort of driving these insights in an automated fashion. So it's not surprising maybe to see a lot of those on the left-hand side of this chart, but I think it is interesting as it relates to go-to-market in terms of understanding how you want to be positioning your tooling when you're selling to large enterprises in a way that is most likely to generate the most budget, because rip and replace is generally easier than getting net new budget. On the sort of right side of this, you see things like real-time data streaming, data privacy, AI ML. Those all are much more likely to be net new budget. And I think especially on AI and machine learning, what we've learned from speaking with large enterprises is they are super willing to generate net new budget dollars for things like AI and machine learning use cases. I think they just need to see the return on investment. It just, like, again, from a go-to-market perspective, you really want to be thinking about how do I describe my solution in terms of ROI, because it is net new budget. It's not rip and replace. And I think this is generally just true of AI and machine learning. We're earlier on in the evolution, and large enterprises really need sort of generally some help thinking about what are the use cases that we can use machine learning for and how can I implement those use cases. But once you can sort of describe that very clearly, they're more than willing to generate massive amounts of net new budget, which is really exciting for the category more broadly. So that's sort of the thinking on budget allocation. What you have here, and I'll describe the slide and then speak to some of the insights on it. On the x-axis, you have the likelihood to experience innovation. So one of the first charts that we spoke about in terms of these themes. So more on the right-hand side of this chart, you're seeing categories where chief data officers think there's likely to be a lot of innovation over the next 5 years. On the y-axis, you have likelihood to invest budget. And so in the upper right-hand corner, you have categories where chief data officers think there's going to be a lot of innovation, and they're likely to put money behind those tools that are, newly innovative. On the bottom left-hand side, you have categories where chief data officers think that there's less likely to be innovation, or they think there is less innovation coming over the next 5 years, and they are less likely to allocate budget towards those tools. So I'm a former consultant, which is why I had to throw the 2x2 in here at some point. But I think what's interesting is you see, again, these trends like data orchestration and transformation, smart analytics, real-time data streaming, data observability and reliability, and access controls really going up into the right-hand side of this chart, where I think chief data officers are sort of always interested in thinking and talking about new technologies in that space, and they're more than willing to spend budget dollars on that category. And this, came through very clearly, obviously, in our survey work, which we're showing you. But I think important to note is consistent with a lot of the just conversations and interviews that we do with chief data officers more broadly, where every time we talk to them and share some of these thesis work with them, they're always like, oh, what are interesting companies in this space and how can we pilot them and things of that nature. And so it does seem fairly consistent with the conversations that we've had. So in this next category of questions, we asked chief data officers to really put themselves in the mindset of being 3 to 5 years into the future. And we asked them to think about how they think their data stack from an infrastructure and usage perspective are likely to change over that time horizon. And we gave them a bunch of questions, and we said, rate, in sort of the green dot, we said, rate where you think you fall on this spectrum today, and where do you think you will fall on the spectrum in 5 years? And that's the yellow star. And I'll go through each of these and speak to some of the insights that came out of it. But broadly, as you look down this page, on the left-hand side, you have more centralized and standardized. And on the right-hand side, you have more distributed and decentralized. And the green dot shows where chief data officers think they are on that spectrum today. And the yellow star is where these chief data officers think that they will likely move over the next 5 years. And so from an infrastructure perspective, you can see that generally, if you just quickly scan across all of these categories, there's more movement towards centralized and standardized, with the exception of data accessibility. And I'll speak through that in a second. But on the data storage piece, chief data officers think that over the next 5 years, they will likely move more towards something that looks like centralized storage in one location, away from something that looks like keeping their data in a variety of different places. Now, I think there's a lot of nuance behind this that we could speak to, and some of it has to do with like how you conceptualize keeping your data all in one location. But I think that's when you ask chief data officers, they sort of think of themselves moving more in this direction. On data queries, generally they think they're sort of largely in the middle of moving a little bit more towards ad hoc exploratory queries versus more standardized reports. On data accessibility, this is where it sort of bucks the trend. You can see a massive movement towards self-service for business users, away from something that's centrally delivered by IT. That is, not surprising. This chart would look even more dramatic for non-Fortune 500 or non-enterprise companies, where I think it's, even more towards the self-service for business users, but not surprising to see that most chief data officers think they're trying to move away from something that looks like data is entirely with the IT team where we run the reports, and much more towards, hey, if you want to run a report or run quick analytics on something, you can do it sort of in a self-serve fashion. On data access controls, moving more towards, and this is not surprising as you think about trends around data privacy and things of that nature, but probably moving more towards data access controls being centrally consolidated and controlled through a tool, through the chief data officer, versus having sort of distributed departments deciding who has access to different tooling or different reports and data. And then in terms of data procurement, probably still leaning a little bit more towards going through the chief data officer, but slight movement towards folks being able to choose their own tools. And again, remembering that this is the perspective of enterprise companies is quite important here, as you think about that being probably fundamentally different between sort of more mid-market and SMBs. And so those are the trends that we see, at least from the chief data officer perspective, in terms of where they think the world is likely to go in terms of data infrastructure. We ask the same set of questions for data usage. And again, here you'll see even more pronounced this movement towards centralized and standardized, and away from sort of distributed and decentralized. And that, shows up here in key business metrics. And I think this was actually a surprise to me, but folks generally thought they were likely to move towards more metrics defined specifically by the executive team and the chief data officer, and less by individual departments deciding what key metrics they were likely to key in on. The second is standardized metrics. And again, this bucks the trend a little bit, where I think folks think they're moving a little bit more towards having a separate layer for standardized metrics, and less towards like, these are the metrics that we have that sit within the data warehouse. Now, that's not entirely surprising as you think about if we're standardizing around a set of metrics that are being decided on by the chief data officer and executive team, then maybe we put those metrics in a separate layer, and then we allow that layer of metrics to be used by a variety of different technologies, whether that's in the data warehouse, in the data lake, in the BI tooling, things of that nature. And I think it does point to solving some of the pain points that we heard around single source of truth and data silos. And so that's, not entirely surprising. On the data analytics tooling, we see a big shift here from specific data applications tailored for specific business units towards a horizontal and flexible data analytics platform. And this again is, quite married to the concept on the previous slide, which is movement towards more self-serve data analytics. And I think in general, the chief data officers would prefer there to be a platform that everyone is using that allows folks to sort of DIY come up with their own analytics, versus having every department using a different tool. And again, this sort of points to this concept of, it's a huge pain point today that there's no single source of truth in terms of analytics. In data science tooling, you see a similar movement as I just described. And finally, in data transformations, again, this concept of like, how can we be a little bit more standardized in the transformations that we're making with the data so that it's not a situation where individual users are transforming the data for their own use and then generating reports based on those transformations, but rather a scenario where you have data being transformed once, and that is the transformation that's being leveraged by a variety of different teams, allowing you to sort of trust your data more over time. And so this, I think, is just quite interesting in terms of when you ask chief data officers to put themselves in the mindset of the future, here's where they think things are likely to trend. I think related to that point, we just straight up asked, like, all right, what will the world look like in 3 years? If you imagine your data organization across these different categories, like force choose, what do you think is most likely to happen? And the first is data storage. And I know there's a lot on this slide, so I'll sort of move bar to bar. The first is data storage. And the most common answer here is that folks think data will be split between a data warehouse and a data lake. And so there will be this sort of optimization around where you're putting your data for both cost and usage and compute reasons. The second is data prep. And the most common answer here is the data will be transformed between the data storage layer and the BI layer. And so people think it won't be sort of like, hey, we transform it for use quickly as we're using it in the BI layer, or we transform it for use within the data warehouse. Folks think that generally there will be a separate layer for transformations that sits in between this data warehouse layer and this BI layer, which is a departure from sort of the traditional ETL type of thinking where it's happening before it gets put into the data storage center. Relatedly, this third bar is on transformations. This is sort of, I think folks are split on this, which points to how early we are in the evolution of this space. But generally, folks are saying by a hair, 5149, you can see that this data will sit in a separate layer versus transformations taking place at the moment the business user needs the data, which I think sort of is an interesting difference from the previous bar that we just spoke to. In terms of data governance, I think folks generally think like, hey, there will be a data pipeline managed by a separate tool across, the data pipeline will be managed by a separate tool across the entirety of the pipeline, something like a Datadog for data versus for, observability for DevOps. And I think that's different than having a traditional data governance tool manage data reliability and observability, something like Calibra sort of tacking on those capabilities. This next to last bar is data analytics. And by far the most common answer here is analytics are run by business users through BI tools, which is interesting because I think, you hear a lot about augmented analytics and analytics automatically surface to business users to help drive their decision making. But when you ask chief data officers where, when you put yourself in 3 years, like what is the most likely outcome here, folks sort of still think that analytics are going to be run through BI tools in some capacity. And then finally, on data purchasing, most chief data officers, perhaps not surprisingly, think that data purchasing will happen through chief data officers or CIOs and less sort of through like independent bottoms up purchasing decisions. Now, that is different than what folks are actually using in their day-to-day, but in terms of like actually purchasing the tools and allocating budget, chief data officers think that it will continue to sort of sit within their domain. And this last page here is, who will all of this data be controlled by? We've talked a lot about sort of where the data is coming from, what pieces of technology it's flowing through, things like that. But we wanted to also check, how reliant are you on IT to achieve your data goals as an organization today? And how will that change in 5 years? And then how important are these different roles to your data org today, and how will that change in 5 years? So on the left-hand side on reliance on IT, definitely not surprising, but you just see this massive shift away from relying on IT to be able to access and leverage data to drive interesting decisions for your business over time. And so I think that's sort of not surprising, but certainly came through in the survey that we ran. And then more interestingly, on the right-hand side here is how important is each of the following roles to your data organization? And I think the exciting part for all of us in this space is the dark blue bar is higher than the light blue bar for all of these roles, indicating that just folks who are dealing with data are more important 5 years from now, which is pretty cool. But where you see the biggest jump, perhaps, and I think most interestingly, is for data analysts, maybe 50%, six or so. So 50% of folks think it's extremely important today, and 60% think it will be extremely important going forward. So sort of you see that massive jump. And then where you see sort of an outsize just from a volume perspective of who's important, everyone seems to think business users are quite important roles in your data organization and will continue to increase in importance over time. And I think that again points to many of these themes that we've been talking about around getting more of this data into the hands of your business users to drive decisions within your organization going forward. And so that's sort of all we have in terms of running the data survey and some of the insights that came out of our conversations and survey with these chief data officers. We do a ton of work having conversations not only with enterprise data organizations, but SMBs and mid-market and data technologists in the space, data experts from GCP and otherwise. And we're always excited and willing to chat about these concepts and learn more from you all about what you're doing in the space. And so if anything in here was interesting, or you disagreed with it, or you had questions on it, or you want the raw data, like, please reach out. We're so excited to continue to talk and learn about this category. And yeah, thanks so much for the time.